It is week 2 of Texts in the City here at the Wheeler Centre, an examination and a celebration of Year 12 texts. And thank you for the thousands of letters of complaint that have poured in saying that Texts in the City only perpetuates the misnomer that the series Sex and the City is called Sex in the City, which a lot of people call it. Well, the organisers have taken your heated objections on board and have decided to obstinately stick with Texts in the City, because the Wheeler Centre is actually geographically located in the city, and so are the texts if you bothered to bring them along with you today. So it feels better to say that we are enjoying Texts in the City rather than we're saying Texts and the City, especially as the text discussion can sometimes get so enjoyable and all-consuming in here that we forget that the city's involved at all. It's just all the text. It's just all today, and today it's going to be all the Crucible, Arthur Miller's great play that he wrote in the early 50s. My name's Tony Wilson. I'm the author of 2 novels, 5 children's books and a travel memoir. I'll plug them at the end. But before I do that, I want to introduce our guest today. It is William Henderson. William, together with Anne Thompson, founded the 11th Hour Theatre Company in 2001. And this award-winning company focuses on juxtaposing poetic and dramatic language in theatre performances and reframing classic texts. And William works for the 11th Hour in various capacities as co-artistic director, dramaturg and producer, and he's also a writer and performer. I'd like you to put your hands together for our guest, William Henderson.
Thank you.
William, I've given a very straight-lifted from the bio definition of the 11th Hour. What sort of theatre company is it, and why did you form it?
Yes, that's a difficult question to answer. We formed it because we thought there was a sense of language, meaning words, being rather neglected in contemporary theatre, and that the theatre had succumbed to a succession, if you like, of rather rapturous visual images, and that there was something being lost. And so that was one of our concerns. And the other was a concern about something called space, which is much misunderstood. If you go to most of the theatres that have been built in the last 10 years in Melbourne, you'll find they're all proscenium arch theatres, meaning there's a stage at one end which has a fourth wall, and there's people all the way back, as there are here, right down to the end. And there are much more interesting theatres that can be used and built, and we decided to try and demonstrate this, so we bought an old church hall and we've used it in every possible configuration except a proscenium arch.
Well, if we take you back to 2005, why the decision to produce The Crucible? What attracted you to the play?
Well, I realised that actually the honest answer, don't answer that, it could be your mum. The honest answer is I saw it as a child and I was quite riveted, but I never realised that at the time. We chose The Crucible for 2 reasons. One, because the language is extraordinary, and I think we might come back to that. Miller's achievement in constructing, if you like, almost a new language is quite remarkable and perhaps a bit unnoticed in discussions about the play. But more importantly, we chose it because at the time the Prime Minister of our great country was running a scare campaign against the small number of innocent refugees coming from Asia, and suggesting that anyone who disagreed with him was un-Australian. And this, in a mild way, was reminiscent of what happened in the McCarthy era in America when Miller wrote his play in protest at that behaviour. So in a quiet way, I suppose, we were trying to make that point, because I think plays come and go, but the good plays keep coming back because they have something to say about the time in which we live, not just the time in which the playwright lived. And we felt there was something rather bad happening in this country, which is still happening, of course, and we felt like saying something about it.
And if you'd let me read from the Age review that was written about your production. Beyond any individual performance, though, what strikes the spectator is the synergy the actors create between them. Credit where credit's due, The Crucible is masterfully directed with an orchestra orchestration of movement and space that never allows the eye to wander and is almost balletic in its precision. Ultimately, you leave the theatre not only with a sense of how accomplished the production is, but also of how apposite a play this is for our times. I had a speech from Miller's Hanging Judge ringing in my ears. A person is either with this court or he must be counted against it. There is no road between. This is a sharp time now, a precise time. We live no longer in the dusky afternoon when evil mixed itself with good and befuddled the world. Now, by God's grace, the shining sun is up, and them that fear not light will surely praise it. Sound like anyone? The leader of the free world, perhaps. And that's how the review ended.
Obviously, we should always believe everything that's said in the papers. Yes.
Yeah, but you mentioned Howard. Obviously, for the younger people in the room, it's probably been mentioned already, but there was an American president who managed to slightly contract the sentence, a person who's either with this court or must be counted against it.
Yep.
In recent times.
Yes, indeed.
Are there any other modern moments where you've had cause to think about the play, any of the characters in it or any of the themes?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's better to think about Miller. I was reading his autobiography, and he says the extraordinary thing about the Crucible is every time a tyranny rises or looks like it's falling, the Crucible gets put on. And so I don't know what's happening in North Africa and the theatres at the moment, but it wouldn't surprise me if the Crucible was being put on in a language very different to our own. It is an enduring monument against tyranny, and I think it's a very important work for that reason. Yeah.
What about the language? You mentioned that one of the raison d'etres for the company is to try and celebrate interesting and different language in theatre. Why is this language, the actual words in the play, either interesting or different?
Well, Miller, beyond the Crucible, writes basically what we'd call American naturalism. I mean, it's the language of the street in America in his own time. But when he's writing The Crucible, he's faced with a very different problem because he's writing about a Puritan community in 17th century New England, and their language was profoundly different. And he knew this because he went and read the records of the Salem witch trials, and they were Puritans, of course, and they were steeped in the language of the Bible. And but he couldn't reproduce their spoken language because, of course, there was no proper record. So one of the sort of unsung achievements, I think, of this play is that Miller concocts from his own knowledge of the King James Bible, but also from these Salem records, a plausible sounding 17th century language. It's not that, but it sounds to us like that, and it also works theatrically. And any actor will tell you that Crucible is a joy to act because the language is so good. But it's certainly nothing to do with what has dominated American theatre for the whole of the last century, American naturalism. It's a long way removed from that. So it's quite unusual both in Miller's canon of work but also in the American canon, because the Americans have been devoted both in their film and their theatre to naturalism for I would say, far too long. That's an opinion, by the way.
What about the way that the play was first produced? You had some limitations, I understand, in producing it in your church in Fitzroy, that meant that you didn't have the full cast that it was written for. What about the way that it was first produced when it was put on Broadway?
Yes, our limitations were money. Actors need to be paid because they do it professionally, and so we had 7 actors, and there are 21 parts in Miller's play. So we reduced the number of characters to 13, I think, and 7 actors played 13 parts. But the history of Miller's own production on Broadway is very interesting. Miller had a favourite director, a man called Elia Kazan, who was an extremely good director. And in the weeks just prior to Miller starting to write the play, Kazan was hauled before the House of Un-American Activities, about which you all know a lot. And he recanted and named all sorts of people. So at that point, meaning he labelled people as communists, and they never worked again in America. This is in Hollywood. Kazan and Miller at that point parted company because Miller refused to name people. So Miller lost his director, and he got one of the worst men in America in to direct his play. There's a wonderful quote in his autobiography which says that everyone has a Jed Harris once in a lifetime, which is a bit like saying everyone has a heart attack once in a lifetime. And this man monstered the actors and generally misdirected the play. to the point where it was a failure on Broadway, despite being both topical and brilliant. And there were elaborate sets and beautiful lighting and a lot of very famous actors all standing facing the front, sort of yelling at the audience, because that's what Mr. Harris thought it required. Finally, Mr. Harrison, the producer, I think, parted company, and Miller took over direction of the play. And he did a very interesting thing. He just turned the actors back to face each other, and so they could really yell at each other. And he got rid of all the sets and painted everything black, and he turned the lights on full, and the play went off like a bomb. And this interested us because essentially, despite the language, Miller's play is seen as realistic, if you like, naturalistic. To my mind, I don't think it is. I think it's actually quite stylised, and Miller himself discovered that when he directed it. It's more what I would say a modernist piece. It doesn't actually need grand sets or costumes or lighting or a proscenium arch. It needs a lot of good actors working very hard to create the drama, which is beautifully constructed by Miller. It's a language piece primarily. It needs very little else. And so in that sense, I would call it high modernism almost, rather than naturalism.
What about the structure? Obviously, his other plays, I saw My Three Sons at MTC 2 years ago, Death of a Salesman. A lot of these students would have studied that along the way as well. He has an amazing ability, even just I bolted through the Crucible in 2.5 hours, an amazing ability to keep you going and generate momentum. What are sort of the tricks he has in terms of the act-by-act structure of the play?
I think I'm going to fail to answer this question, but I'll have a go. Well, Miller's, I suppose, a master of winding up the scene. I mean, every act ends with a climax and ends in hysteria, and at every point in the act where you think this can't go on much longer, a new person arrives. It's never the person you expect. There are a series of things that Miller does in each act which are both sort of logical and yet surprising. His stagecraft is very well concealed, but it's a bit like clockwork. He knows exactly how to wind it up at each point. And I suppose he has such an ear for language that in a way the language carries him through a lot of it too. I mean there isn't a page where you aren't surprised by the ordering of the words. I'll give you an example. I even found a copy of the play. It takes me about an hour to get my book out because I have to find my glasses and turn my brain on. So just talk amongst yourselves for a moment.
I'll never stop. Don't let them start talking, whatever you do.
So, very end of the play, and Proctor's finally torn the thing up and he's going out to hang. And Rebecca, the old woman, says, who's going to hang with him? Let you fear nothing. Another judgment waits for us all. Well, that's fine. Hang them high over the town. Who weeps for these weeps for corruption. Now, I defy any of you to ever say that to your mother at any point in your life. We don't speak like this. But it's fantastic writing. I mean, to start the sentence, who weeps for these, we don't know what he's talking about. By the end, we do. So I'm just bringing you back again to the language. So much hangs on the incredibly beautifully constructed language, which, as I say, is, to my mind, entirely artificial. Nobody knows how they spoke in 17th century New England or anywhere else. We know how they wrote, but as you know, how we write, or indeed text, is very different from how we speak.
If we talk about the idea of a flawed hero, and it's interesting that you mention Rebecca, is it? Rebecca Nurse, I think.
Yes.
Who's in that scene. She's sort of painted as almost the lily-white, pure-hearted, genuine martyr of the book, with John Proctor, the man wrestling with this decision and very aware of his own failings as a man, I guess, throughout. And that's the private drama that he's going throughout the play. Can you talk about the importance of that private struggle to the success of the play and to the structure of the play? Just generally talk about that the flawed hero sense of John Proctor.
Yes, Miller goes on to very dangerous ground there, doesn't he, towards the end. I will come back to the question because there's a sense that Proctor will recant until he sees Rebecca Nurse come into the room. and then he realises he can't do it in front of her. He could almost do it in front of his wife. So it's almost like she rescues the play at that point, and that he might just have gone quietly. It's quite a bold thing to do, and it tends to go unnoticed in a lot of productions. But the fact that Rebecca nurses, if you like, the conscience of the piece. Yes, the triangle between Proctor and Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Proctor is a very fascinating story in the play, but also in terms of the way it's been talked about, because of course what is not often mentioned in conversation about the play, least of all by Miller, is that Miller himself was married to one woman and having an affair with another at the time he wrote this play, and the other person he was having an affair with was someone you've probably heard of called Marilyn Monroe. So this was a fairly public affair, and his own marriage was in a high state of disintegration, not surprisingly. And so there's a fair level of emotional fuel, if you like, going into Miller's writing of this piece. But it's not clear from the many versions, if you like, of how the play was written, where the truth actually lies. I mean, Abigail Williams in the actual documentary record was 11, not 17. So it's extremely unlikely she had an affair with Proctor, although people matured early in that era, I know that. But Miller suggests that he got a whiff of this affair when he was reading the records. How he got that whiff we don't know, except that of course Elizabeth Proctor puts Abigail out on the road. But various other people, including his biographer, said that there's no evidence that Williams and Proctor had an affair. So a complicated, if you like, rewriting of history going on, or uncertainty about history. But be that as it may, that's not finally important. The important thing is the play got written. It's quite clear that in Miller's mind, the engine, if you like, for making the play work is that triangle. And of course it is pretty dynamic and pretty scary. And the fact that the young woman can possibly get his wife hung and then hope to live with Proctor is a dangerous and absorbing thought. And the whole sense of, if you like, illicit sexuality that hangs over the play, I think is a powerful engine in the play and often ignored. Shall I go to that scene we were talking about earlier, Tony? The play you read, of course, is just one version of the play. Everybody thinks that a play is in a book published by Penguin and that's the play. The play is actually nowhere. There is no play. There are just things that the author wrote and someone put them together. You probably think there's a play called Hamlet. Well, actually there isn't. There are 3 different texts, all called Hamlet, all written by Shakespeare, and you can take your pick. And the same is true of Miller. The Crucible that we have is one version, and it's the one mostly done. But there is a scene that Miller wrote which he had intended to include, which we included in our production, but is rarely put in the text. And I would suggest you go and find it. It's a very interesting scene because it tells you a lot about where Miller might have gone and what he thought the play was about. It's between Proctor and Abigail after Act 3, at the beginning of Act 4. And so Hale has stormed out and Danforth has condemned Proctor to hang and all is doomed. And suddenly there's a scene in the woods. This is, you know, where the dancing took place between Proctor and Abigail. And Abigail is quite clearly mad. She has been driven mad by her own fantasies and her own hysteria, but she still holds on to the fantasy that she's going to purge the town, and she still holds on to the fantasy that once Goody Proctor, as she's called, Elizabeth Proctor, is dead, she will marry John Proctor and that they will live happily ever after. So that was a thread that was very powerfully in Miller's mind right up until the point that they started rehearsing the play. And for various reasons he decided not to put it in. I think it's a pity. I think structurally the play, he was right. The play's perfect. It's beautifully structured. But it's worth a look because it tells you a lot about Miller's focus and intentions around that very potent triangle that is, if you like, the emotional engine to the play rather than the political circumstance in which it sits.
And one of the things I found a little odd about the play, I guess on first reading and thinking about it, was how these relatively powerless individuals, and in particular I was thinking of Tituba, who would be, is that how you say it?
Tituba, yeah.
Tituba, who would be in the most powerless group in society. But even Abigail Williams is an orphan, and she's been taken in by families to look after her, but she's certainly not anyone with any sort of status in Salem society, and yet their ability to sort of quiver and say they've seen someone with the devil is condemning one after another these quite stately people in society like Elizabeth. And I was wondering how possible that is. Although I must say we are here in Melbourne living through the St Kilda schoolgirl saga, and I read the book a little bit thinking about the way that's unfolding, I guess.
Yes, and the revolution that's taking place in Northern Africa is fuelled entirely by the young, clearly.
Yeah.
It's not fuelled by fundamental... I mean, there are fundamentalist elements, but it is fuelled by a youth demographic of people like yourselves. Go and start a revolution. Please do. It's a good time. When you get older, you get tired and you're less keen to have a revolution, but you guys can do it any time you like. It's fun.
Yeah.
You have to clean up afterwards. That's the only problem.
What about symbolism within the play? Students are always ladled so they can take some notes in this thing and not just get extra tidbits. Were there things that you tried to stress? Was there props you used in your production that augmented some of the words that you think that Miller was stressing? I mean, even the symbolism of the Crucible itself as a title, is there anything you'd offer there?
I fear the answer is no, but that's an unhelpful answer. Coming off this story that I told you about Miller pruning back his design, we made a sort of vortex, a tunnel of black that went to a point, and we put a small, long refractory table at the back and then a larger one closer to the audience, so there was a diminishing perspective. And we acted the whole thing with just those two tables. And so the sort of hysterical seance with the girls at the end of Act 1, they were all climbing up on the table and they produced a huge structure which nearly fell down every night. And in the trial, we tipped the tables up so they became like gibbets or something that these people would be hung on. And in the last scene, we tipped them right upside down and we made them a sort of walkway to the gallows. So I suppose we were working not so much off symbolism, which I agree is in the play, but off the notion of theatre where everything on the stage is able to be transformed. We're working with transformable props, I suppose, and we wanted the image to come off this very basic and simple structure because we wanted to keep saying, listen to the words, don't look at the set, just listen to what's going on. And we wanted the actors, who were very fine, I might say, to have that challenge that they weren't going to get a lot of support. So that's a long way of saying, no, we didn't do anything with symbols. I got out of that quite well, didn't I? Did you notice that? I didn't get told off for that.
What about the Crucible itself being, I think a Crucible, it was called the Crucible, I think, because that's something in which you raise the temperature on things and
in order to purify.
In order to purify,
yes.
Right.
Yes, you burn out impurities at great heat, which is presumably what they thought they were doing in Salem or indeed in 50s America.
As the heat's applied, how would you rate, in terms of audience sympathy, how would you rate the characters in terms of the way they respond to each of as the heat's turned up? And do you think it affects audience sympathy as to what we think of those characters?
He asks quite hard questions, doesn't he?
Don't worry about that one then.
No, that's a hard question to answer. I feel I need help. I mean, the greatness... I'll answer it by saying I think the greatness of the play is that Proctor is an ambivalent figure right through till the end. And because he has, he's complicit, if indeed he hasn't seduced Abigail. And he shouts at everyone. I mean, I shout at everyone too, so I can understand that. So, and he's, as we were saying earlier, he's a potentially quite violent man in a way I think that current sensibility would be slightly repelled by. But he knows he's done wrong. But when his wife challenges him to go and set it straight with Abigail, he's rather reluctant to go. He's weak and strong. So I think Miller's quite careful in a way. I mean, Rebecca Nurse we've talked about, and Giles Corey, the poor man who's crushed to death, they're clearly martyrs in the great tradition. I mean, there's a sort of sense almost of a Christian martyrdom going on with Giles Corey. But I think the brilliance of the play is that we are flawed, and we know Proctor is flawed, so we can sort of stay with him. And that the play's not too black and white. It's very black about Danforth and Hawthorne and Paris, of course, but and in a way, the most interesting character is Reverend Hale, because Hale goes from being a hanging judge to being someone who's clearly seeing that terrible injustice is being done. So I think Miller modulates it quite cleverly, actually.
I think, and almost all the characters seem to have their moment. Like Mary Warren's, I felt was almost the most gripping page in the book. When you see the technique that the girls are using, which is the parroting back of any words that are in the mouth of a potentially possessed person.
Yeah, that's horrifying, isn't it?
And Mary Warren's strength for a page and a half, I thought was incredible. Like, she's actually up in court, delegitimising a court as an 18-year-old girl in a household, and even if you say she's been bullied to that extent by her master,
yes.
She must also have had a conscience about the point to which Mrs. Elizabeth has reached, and that the way that she responds to that is incredible under that blowtorch of pressure.
Yes, he almost beats her up at the end of the first act, doesn't he? Yes, and you remind me also, I mean, one of the most beautiful scenes in the play is, of course, Elizabeth Proctor at the end, just when you think there's nothing more to say, she confesses her own weakness in the marriage, if you like, and it's almost unbearably moving at the point where Proctor is about to hang. So yes, it's a very cleverly... textured landscape around sympathy, I think. He moves us around a lot.
And Danforth, where there's no movement, at the point where he has his moment of reckoning, when it's becoming quite clear that these girls have manufactured, and he has the opportunity to delay, and he is... to delay would be to show that these other people were wrongfully killed, and he doesn't have the strength at that point. I think that's his moment of failure. Amongst many, but even if, as it was beginning to be revealed to him, he can't move.
Well, there's some very interesting mentions in the trial records that as the girls got more and more excited and condemned people, they used to go and have a drink at the pub and play shovelboard with the judges. So there was a little bit of sort of sexual free-song going on between the judges in the trial and the adolescent girls who were doing all the condemning. So, and you can see that Danforth at a certain moment does wilt under Abigail's pressure. The same thing is true. Yeah. Well,
as it's International Women's Day, and this is a play that was written in the early 50s, so it's kind of pre-feminism as a movement. How do you think women are represented in the play, and do you think that the play has dated in a sense because of the 50, 60 years that have passed since it was written?
Oh, indubitably, yeah, yes. I mean, the Miller's paradigm is male and patriarchal, and one of the things, I'm not sure whether we succeeded, but my colleague Anne and I attempted to do was to slightly, if you like, rephrase the sympathy component around the Abigail figure, rather than seeing her simply as, whore, as Proctor calls her, a dreadful word, but as someone who was marginalised and outside of sympathy, which is again why we found the small scene that is not in the current edition of the play very affecting, because it clearly showed that Miller could have written a different play which was much more sympathetic to Abigail, rather than seeing her simply as the seductress who turns into, avenging angel, but seeing her as a victim of the society in all its patriarchal strictures and horrors. No doubt that there are many ways in which one would like the play to be different on those grounds alone.
Is it interpersonal conflict, or is it conflict within the characters and their relationships?
Now, you're talking about your study guide, which curiously I've read. Well, yes. I think it relates to conflict quite directly. I mean, drama or theatre only works through conflict. I mean, if everyone agrees in a play, then there is no play. And the root words for some of the things that happen in a play coming from the Greek are all about conflict. And so, and yes, it's interpersonal in a vicious and appalling way between Proctor and Abigail and his wife, but it's also broadly, I mean, in the parable that I think Miller is telling, it's about a society, America in this case, tearing itself apart over a bogeyman, which was communism, which it did exist, but probably wasn't the bogey they thought it was. So I think it relates both in inherently, because theatre is a dramatic and therefore a conflict-ridden form, inherently to conflict, but also in terms of the subject matter. The subject matter is entirely about conflict, and also personal inner turmoil. I mean, Proctor's decision about whether to hang or not is not one I would like to make. I'd call that inner conflict at a fairly high level, particularly when you've only got 3 minutes to make the decision. Miller writes that beautifully. I mean, he stretches it out as long as he can, but any decent production of the play, that last 5 minutes is harrowing, absolutely. So I'd say if you want to play with conflict in it, Arthur Miller's quite good for you.
And just as a note, these series of talks are actually about celebrating the text beyond the course notes. So in talking about the language and in talking about the way it was first staged and why it works, it's sort of more than just, yes, there's all the conflict, and your teachers will go through over the course of the year that there's conflict with the indigenous people of America at the time, and the fear out in the woods, and there's conflict between the church and the minister, and he's a really important character in terms of what's his name, John Proctor's relationship with the church is a little bit fractured because he doesn't think this particular minister is. So if you draw a line to every character in the play, between each other almost, there's conflict existing. And we haven't gone through that like English teachers, because your English teachers will.
I was just intrigued by the fact that you said the view of women. You seem to say that it was a bit of a negative one, or it was patriarchal, I think your words were. I see that there's all variety of women in the play, and I just wondered on what you based your ideas.
Oh, I certainly agree with you. I think the women are all beautifully drawn, and Miller does a very fine job of delineating, but I suppose all I'm saying is I think he's writing about a society, and as in a society where women essentially have very little power. Coming back a bit to Toby's remark that it is the powerless in the play who finally come forth and take over. So I don't think I'm saying anything terribly radical or unusual. I'm just reiterating a nostrum, really. But I certainly wouldn't say that the women are underwritten. Far from it. I would agree with you there. I think Miller writes very well for women. And actually, in reading his autobiography, it's actually quite moving hearing him write about Marilyn Monroe, who was a deeply troubled and much put upon person, despite being a megastar and a great beauty. And Miller's description of her frailty is incredibly moving and powerful. So it's a broad brush, is what I'm saying. I don't think I'm critiquing the play in the level of its particular delineations of character.